All right, let's do it like this. Think back to when you were a kid. Think back when you were a child. Think of the first person that comes to your mind when you think of who was someone who really loved me. When you were around that person, how did you feel? Did anybody here have a granny? I had a granny. I still have a granny. But my granny passed away on Friday. That's my granny. Her name is, not was, God is the God of the living, not the dead. Her name is Darlene Whiting. This is a picture from when she was in high school. That's her graduation picture from high school. I don't know the exact year, early 50s. And this is a picture from about 15 years ago. It's a really good thing she passed away. She had dementia. She couldn't speak for the last 7 years maybe of her life. Sad story. But now she can speak. I was thinking this week about things that I can remember and take away from my granny, from her life, what she wanted to build into me. And here's one of the big pieces I can take away from her. She was always laughing and having fun. And the ironic thing about my name, so my name is Isaac, Pastor Isaac, but my name is just Isaac. Does anyone know what the name Isaac means? It means laughter. And from a very young age, I was extremely serious. From a very young age, I was trying to fix the problems of the world, and I was trying to get things done in my life and accomplish tasks. Even before I was 5, I would spend time with my granny, and I would tell her how I was going to solve the problems of the world. And she would always smile and laugh and mess with me, and then she would tell me, "That's great, but Isaac, you need to laugh more. You need to have more fun." And I think one of the big things I can take away from my granny's life is that the driver, the real powerful motivating force in life, the thing that can accomplish greatness, isn't forcing it. It isn't anger or control or duty. It's love and joy. We are in a series right now called Sudden Life. And in this series, I don't have control here either. In this series on Sudden Life, we're going through the book of Mark. We're looking at stories about Jesus. And we've been looking at this Mark and talking about how in the book of Mark there are 2 secrets. The book is structured around 2 great secrets. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at what those secrets are. They were finally revealed in the book. The first secret that was revealed was this, that Jesus is the Christ. The second secret, I'm going to stop using this. The second secret was this, that the Christ must suffer and die. That was bad news at first to the people who were in the story, because if the Christ must suffer and die, the greatest thing that I can do in life, the way to have the best possible life, is to become like him. And if he must suffer and die, that means that's going to have to happen to me too. And so last week we talked about holding nothing back. We looked at chapter 9 and 10 in the book of Mark, and we saw Jesus talking about what it's going to take for us to be made like him. That experience he described, can you remember the ways he described it? Sometimes it will feel like, he said, being salted with fire. It will feel like you're walking through fire. He described what it might feel like sometimes to be transformed by God into who you were made to be. He described that in really graphic images. It might sometimes feel like having part of your body chopped off. It can be really difficult. And he described how for him, he was going to follow God's will by going to the cross and dying for us. And we have to take up our cross, whatever that is in our life, and follow after him. So we talked about last week how we need to hold nothing back from God. Now, that's hard to do. I don't know how you walked away last week at the end, if you were thinking of a particular area in your life that you needed to not hold back from God. You needed to let him do the deep work in that area of your life. Well, how do you do it, though? I mean, it's not easy to allow God to do work in your life that feels like you're walking through fire or feels like part of your body is being chopped off. And this week, Jesus is going to show us how to do it. He's going to show us the key to all of this. The key is going to be love. The key is going to be love itself. We're going to talk about what that means and look at what he says about it. But the first point for today, and Jesus, as he's teaching this, we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 12, and as he's teaching this, he leads up to it. We've got to get rid of our focus on some things. He's going to help us shift our focus to love. But before we can shift our focus to something, we've got to get our focus off of the wrong things. And so the first point I want you to write down in your notes is this, and this came from a pastor I met this week. I love the way he put it. The first thing you need to do is this: you need to run away from the stupid stuff. Run away from the stupid stuff. My granny, one thing that she loved, she grew up in church. And one of the things that she loved to talk about was all the dumb stuff that Christians sometimes fight over. She thought it was hilarious. She was actually looking for it in church because then she would want to go out and just laugh about it later. I don't know what some of the dumb things that you've seen people fight about, and it's not just Christians. It's every human being. All human organizations tend to fight over really meaningless things. You've heard of churches maybe fighting over the color of the walls or the color of the carpeting. I looked up, there's a great list out there of 25 real things that churches, congregations have had big arguments over, and some of them are quite hilarious. Here's the first one on the list. An argument in church involving most of the congregation over the appropriate length of the worship pastor's beard. That sounds like something we should be spending our time arguing about. Pastor Jason doesn't even have a beard, so maybe we can start up a discussion about that afterwards. Should he? That could be a really important thing to put into our congregational life. Here's a couple other really important things that churches have sometimes spent their time on. A 45-minute heated argument over the type of filing cabinet to purchase, black or brown, 2 drawers, 3 drawers, or 4. That could make an important difference in the life. No, it can't. That cannot make any important difference. A lot of these seem to be around facial hair. Another church had a long discussion, and a petition actually was circulated around the church to have all church staff become clean-shaven. So if you don't like the beards that I'm sporting or that Tyler's sporting, Tyler, is he in here today? I can't even find him. Tyler, our pastoral intern, if you're watching online, our pastoral intern cut his hair. Actually, Tyler, will you just jump up here for a second? Just jump up here. You're a good illustration. So he's still sporting a rocking long beard, but his long hair has magically disappeared. I don't know if there was a lot of discussion around that. Did you guys circulate a petition to get rid of Tyler's long hair? I think we just allowed him to make that decision on his own, because long hair or short is not really what church is about, is it? You can have a seat. Give him a round of applause for coming up. That's not really what it's about. So my granny thought it was hilarious to laugh at those things. Jesus didn't spend so much time laughing at them as yelling at them and trying to teach people not to do that. Run away from the stupid stuff. So if you've got your Bible, this part I'm going to talk about 2 things that he discusses in Mark chapter 12, but we're not going to read them. We're going to read the third thing, which will be in just a few minutes. But before we get to the third thing, we're in Mark chapter 12 here, and Jesus is giving teaching. He's in the city of Jerusalem. This is near the end of his ministry. He's gone to Jerusalem knowing that he's going to be crucified. Now, if you knew that you were going to die, if you knew that this was the last week of your life for sure, and people around you were arguing about the length of the worship pastor's beard, or the color of the walls, or the carpet, how would you feel in that moment? You have completely missed the point, you people. You would probably not be spending a lot of time joking about that. You would be frustrated. You would be trying to help these people turn from the stupid stuff to what's really important, because you know this is the last week of your life. And this is where Jesus is sitting. He's in the last week of his life, and what happens as he enters Jerusalem, all these religious leaders, they're jealous of him, they're fighting for power amongst themselves, and they're coming up to him with all the wrong motives, just because a lot of people like what he has to say. They want to follow him. And many people are wondering whether he is the one who was supposed to come. Is he the Christ? And these leaders come up to him and they argue with him about all kinds of stuff that it's not as pointless, the stuff that they argue with him about, as the color of the walls. But to Jesus at this moment, even these things are completely unimportant, and these people are missing the point. Some of the leaders come up to him and they start asking him questions about whether or not people should pay taxes. Now, what do you think? Should people pay taxes? All right, so if you're watching online, the consensus at Community of Hope Church, the audible consensus was no, we should not pay taxes. We are going to have a message on that coming up, because we're going to have to correct that. In Canada, in 2019, you should pay your taxes. Come on, our government is relatively good as far as governments in the history of the world go. There are some big things we could complain about, but my goodness, go read your history. Things are going well, and our money, in many ways, is being well spent on the basics. Okay, in that context, in the first century, in Jerusalem, why would many people have thought you shouldn't pay taxes? Because they had been taken over by a foreign enemy. Put yourself in that situation. Another country, a foreign nation, came and took over Canada. British Columbia is occupied territory. So now the question becomes, should I support this country, this government that has come and taken us over by force? Not only that, in their context, many of them believed that the Jewish people were called by God to have their own nation, a nation where they only worshiped the one true God. And the Romans had come in and they worshiped a bunch of other gods that were not real. And so the Jewish people had a real live question in front of them. Should we pay taxes to this government that came in and took us over, and they worship a bunch of pagan gods? They worship a bunch of gods that aren't real. They're leading people the wrong way. Should we pay taxes? And so there were lots of discussions around that. That was a big thing that the Jewish synagogues, their churches, were discussing and arguing about. So they come to Jesus with this question, but they're not genuine about the question. They're actually trying to trap him. Because what happens if Jesus says publicly that you shouldn't pay taxes to the Roman government? What do you think would happen in that situation? The police would come and arrest him and probably execute him. That's what would have happened in those days. And what happens if he says, well, we should pay taxes to the Romans? Well, now he's going to look like he doesn't really trust God. He's going to look like he's allying himself with this enemy government, this enemy army that's taken over. And he's going to lose some of his support. So they are vying for power, and they're arguing about whether or not they should pay taxes to the government. And when they walk up to Jesus and ask him this question in the last week of his life, he, like many times, he is shaking his head, he is sighing, he is groaning. Why? Why are the leaders of the nation of Israel, the people of God, completely blind to the most important things and spending all of their time on things that don't really matter that much? So he does this astonishing thing, this thing that has gone down in history because he was able to flip the tables on them so fast. He says, bring me a denarius. Now, a denarius is just a coin, right? Like a toonie. And on that coin was a picture of the Roman emperor. And he grabbed the coin and he said, whose picture is on this coin? And they said, it's a picture of the emperor. And he said, then give to the emperor what belongs to him. Give him back his stuff, Jesus said. And give to God whatever belongs to God. This is the greatest teacher who has ever lived. Maybe when you've read it, you might think he's just deflecting them and shutting them down. He goes so far beyond that. Not only does he deflect them and shut them down, he in that moment redirects them. He redirects them away from, you shouldn't even be worried at all, thinking about spending your energy and your time focused mainly on, should we pay taxes to the Roman government or not? Your energy should be focused on giving your heart what belongs to God to God. That's where your energy should be focused. And if it is, everything is going to work out okay. God can work out who is in control of your nation. He is fully capable of that. He doesn't need your help. So in that very moment, just like we talked about 4 weeks ago, Jesus is once again focused on what's on the inside. What's on the inside? Those same teachers, they're astonished, and so they shut up at that moment. They don't answer him. He gives them a question that they can't answer. And so they come up with another question. Now, this is perhaps a different group walks up to him. The group, all these groups have funny names, right? The first group is the Pharisees. The second group is the Sadducees, right? These are silly names. But the Sadducees were people who had allied themselves. They were priests, leaders who had allied themselves with the occupying government. And they didn't really believe a lot of things about the Bible anymore. And in particular, one of the things that they didn't believe anymore was they didn't believe that people would one day rise from the dead. Now, you can understand why. That's actually, if you haven't grown up believing that, that's actually a little bit of a hard thing to believe. I don't know about you, I've never seen anyone come back to life from the dead in front of my eyes. But the clear teaching of the Bible over thousands of years is that my granny, as well as every other human being who's ever died, one day will come back to life. That's a remarkable thing to think about. Can you imagine, if that's true, can you imagine what that day will be like? The Bible describes it as the greatest day and a terrible day all at the same time. Because everything that's been inside every human heart will be revealed to the whole world and before God. But the Sadducees, they had spent a lot of time reading, philosophy, Greek and Roman philosophy, and they no longer believed that what the Bible said was actually true. So they came up to Jesus and they wanted to trap him, and they have this long argument about why it can't be true. It can't be true that there is a resurrection, that people will one day come back to life from the dead. And Jesus immediately shuts them down. You can read through that on your own outside, exactly how he shuts them down. But he immediately shuts them down and reminds us what I reminded us of at the beginning this morning, that God is the God of the living, not the dead. Those who have died in Christ are not gone. And so don't spend all of your time worried about the things that are happening in this life right now. All the details that are happening in your life, you do have to pay attention to them enough. But they are not the end of the story. They're not the whole story, because when you die, you will not cease to exist. No human being ceases to exist. This is the point that Jesus brings to these leaders very strongly. God is the God of the living, not the dead. You are badly mistaken. You're focused on external things. So Jesus has set all this up, teaching these guys to run away from the stupid stuff, the external stuff, the stuff that doesn't matter all that much. And now he goes into a section. This section is often called the greatest commandment. And in this section, Jesus cuts right to the heart, right to the point of life itself. If there were one thing in life that you could focus on, if you could only focus on one thing in life and you wanted to have a successful life, what would that one thing have to be? Jesus cuts straight to the heart. He's had all these teachers who thought they were so smart coming up to him in front of these large crowds, and he has shut them all down, one after another. And there's one man in the crowd who's been listening to him, also a rabbi, a teacher, a pastor in the crowd, who's been listening and realizes that Jesus is he's not just a great miracle worker. He's not just a powerful prophet or someone sent by God. He also has the truth. This man who's listening to Jesus realizes that Jesus has answered very well. And he wants to know. He comes in and he asks the question, okay, Jesus, I've been trying to get this for a long time. So what is it? If there's only one thing that we could focus on, if I were going to make my life about just one thing to make my life be what it should be, what is that one thing? Let's read it together. We'll have it up on the screen. It's also on the back of your notes. This is Mark chapter 12, starting at verse 28. Jesus is going to take two pieces of the Old Testament, and simply by putting them together, he is going to explain, reveal, and make very practical exactly what they mean. In this short section, it is not an understatement to say that Jesus gives a teaching that changes the course of history. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given a good answer, here's somebody who actually knows what he's talking about. He asked Jesus, of all the commandments, of everything God's asked us to do, which one is the most important? Jesus doesn't hesitate for a second. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, people of God. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second most important commandment is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. The man, no doubt astonished, replies, well said, teacher. You are right in saying that God is one and there is no other God but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices, than all the other stuff that we do, all the tasks. When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. No one dared ask him any more questions. What was the tone in that crowd? In that scene in Jerusalem, in the temple, what was the tone after Jesus gave this answer? You can almost feel it, can't you? Jesus spoke these words. He had this conversation. Everyone around realized that this man who was asking Jesus questions, he was far beyond their understanding. They were all focused on taxes and arguing about different parts of the Bible and who's going to be in control. And this one man, this one teacher was far beyond that. And yet, even in that, Jesus was far beyond him. Even as Jesus says these few words, you can feel the hush fall over the crowd. At the end of this, not a few minutes earlier when Jesus had amazingly shut down the Sadducees and the Pharisees left and right as they attacked him, but in this moment, everyone realizes that something has been spoken that is beyond anything they've ever heard. This is not like any teaching that the world has ever received before. And I think if you were in that crowd, you could feel that if we could just do this, everything would work out. He is cut straight to the heart. This is the point of life itself. Now, we need to understand a couple of things before we understand what Jesus means exactly by these two commandments. The two commandments are, the two things that he says are the greatest commandment. So he's asked for the one greatest thing that you can focus on, and he gives two answers because they're two sides of the same coin. The two things that he said are love your God and love your neighbor. So we need to understand, number one, what love means, because that's kind of a tricky word. And if we don't get it right, then we might not understand what he's saying. The second word that we won't automatically, I think, understand is the word neighbor. We need to understand what Jesus means by neighbor. So first, the word love. What in the world does the word love mean in the Bible? What is love? Can you give me a definition? It's a rhetorical question. Don't raise your hand. You didn't anyway. I'm not going to try and give you a definition of love today. The reason is that every definition I've ever heard falls short in some significant way. Love is actually very difficult to explain in words what it is. But here's the other reason I'm not going to try and give you a definition is you don't really need one. You already know what it is. All right, so we could say, sometimes we've said, love is a feeling. Sometimes much of our culture looks like love is a feeling. It's that feeling that I get when I fall in love with someone else. So sometimes the church has pushed back on that and said, no, love is not a feeling. But while it's true that love is not just a feeling, if all I have for someone is a feeling, feelings are temporary, aren't they? And so that feeling will sometime go away. And if I only love someone for a short time, only when I feel like it, then I don't really love them, do I? But at the same time, what if I said, I love my wife, I love Amber, but I never had any positive feelings toward her? Would it be true that I loved her? No, it would not. So when it looks like our culture is saying love is a feeling, and we know that that's not true. Love is certainly not just a feeling. But is love not a feeling? Well, no, that's not true either. Love must have some element of feeling to it. At the beginning, I asked you to think about someone in your life when you were a child who you knew really loved you. Nod your head if you thought of that person, if you had a person who came to your mind. This is a person who, when I was around them, I just knew that they loved me. Didn't that have to do with feelings? Yes, it did. It had to do with how they felt and how you felt. Love also has to do with choices that we make. If I love someone, I'm going to sacrifice for them. I'm going to do things for them. I'm going to want what's good for them above, or at least as much as I want what's good for me. Isn't that true of the person that you were thinking of? That person would have sacrificed. Very likely they did sacrifice many things for you. And so love definitely has to do with making choices, but it is not just a choice. It must have choice. It must involve our choices. It must involve our feelings. In fact, love has to involve our bodies as well in significant ways. What if I said that I loved my wife and I never gave her a hug or a kiss? That would be odd, wouldn't it? Love, in fact, is connected to everything that we are. Love is, I'm not going to give you a definition, but it's some kind of condition of your entire soul. All of who you are is what love is. But all we really need to recognize what it is to think about that person who really loved us. That's love, and that's what he's talking about. Now let's talk for a minute about what does neighbor mean. In this case, for us, when we think of neighbor, maybe the first thing that comes to your mind is the people who live next to you. Neighbor is a word that if we look at its origins in English, it just means someone who is near me. And that is the same. The word in Greek is similar. It means those who are around me, someone who is close to me. It often in those days meant someone who lived next to me. But for us today, we need to expand it a little bit because many of us don't spend a lot of time around the person who lives right next to us, do we? Do you know all of your neighbors? Raise your hand if you know all of your neighbors. I'm curious about this. Okay, about half. I don't know all of my neighbors. I know a couple of them fairly well, and some of them I've only just waved at because they're across the street, and my street's kind of busy, and that's hard. Those people, while they are acquaintances of mine, what Jesus is getting at here, what's important for understanding the commandment, is that he is suggesting we need to love the people who are around us. Not necessarily physically, just physically around us. The people who are near us, who are close to us, the people who are in our lives. That's what he's saying. We need to love the people who are in our lives as much as we love ourselves. So there's a little understanding of the two words that we have here. Now I want to give you the next 2 points for your notes. You can fill these in. And I hope that this will help us understand what he means and how these two commands clarify each other. The first point is this: love your neighbor is what love for God looks like. Love your neighbor is what love for God looks like. The first commandment that Jesus gives in this moment is a command that the nation of Israel had had for well over 1,000 years. The command to love the Lord God with all their heart, their mind, their soul, and their strength. This is a command that they had been taught since they were little children. The problem was that sometimes that command was totally misunderstood. Sometimes what people did when they just heard this bare command, you got to love God with everything that you have, they took that to mean, okay, that means I need to study the Bible 24/7. Now, studying the Bible is certainly part of loving God. It certainly is. People took that command to mean I need to fast and pray until I am totally exhausted and give it all, lay it all on the floor for God. And sometimes we do. Prayer and fasting are important ways that we follow after God. But sometimes this command, the command love God, was taken to mean I must follow absolutely every rule that God has given to the T. And if I don't, or if I see someone else around me who's not doing it, I need to get really, really upset. I need to beat myself. I need to whip myself with cords to make sure that I do absolutely everything God has told me to do. And I need to make sure the people around me do it too. And so if somebody around me isn't doing one of the commands that God said, they're paying taxes to the Roman government, I got to go attack them. That's what some people had taken love for God to mean. Do you see how the command, while it's good, had been completely misunderstood? And here's how Jesus clarifies it. He takes two pieces of the Old Testament. Love your neighbor as yourself is also a command they'd had for thousands of years, and he just puts them together. What does love for God look like? It looks like love for the people who are in your life. It doesn't mean that's all it is. If you love God, you certainly will love the people in your life, but it means that's the tone that it has. Think about that person that you thought of at the beginning again, the person who loved you when you were a kid. The way that you felt around them. That's what love for God is like. You need to cultivate in yourself the feelings, the decisions, the whole life that will result in you having that kind of relationship with God that that person who loved you had with you. That relationship is love. And it looks totally different than some of the ways people had understood it. It doesn't look like getting super mad at the people who are around you because they're not doing the right thing all the time. It doesn't look like beating yourself up over the little mistakes that you've made. It looks like true love. That's what it looks like. The second point, the next point that you can write down is this: love your God makes it possible to love your neighbor as yourself. So by placing these two things together, Jesus has clarified for us what they mean. He has made it, the two of them together make it possible to do them. How can I love my neighbor as much as myself? You know, that is the most challenging thing in life, isn't it? Life would be really quite easy if it weren't for other people in the world. The hard part is that it's not just me. The world isn't all about me, and there are other people who are also real human beings. And they have different ideas, different desires than me, and I have to somehow get along with them. That's the hard part about life. It's easy to say, love your neighbor as much as you love yourself, but if we think about what that means, and you put it into a particular situation in your life, it all of a sudden becomes something that for human beings is absolutely impossible on our own. Really? Love my neighbor? Think of a person who's close to you right now who you have issues with, who you struggle with. Think of the times in the past when you've struggled the most with the people who are closest to you, your parents, your children, your spouse. Those are the people we have the most difficult time with some of the time because they're closest to us. How is it even possible to love others, those who are near me, as much as I love myself? How much time do you spend dealing with the things that you have to do in your life? Taking care of yourself, thinking about your own thoughts and your own plans? A lot of time. Most of your waking hours are spent dealing with your own stuff. And that's normal. I'm not saying that that's bad. That's just natural. But to change into a person who loves other people, who is concerned with the person who's close to me as much as I'm concerned with myself, that seems absolutely impossible. How could it ever happen? It only happens. It is only able to happen as a miracle of God when I begin to grow in my love for God himself. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is gentle. Love does not boast. The Bible shows us that love has incredible power. I want it to be very clear here that it's love that has that power. The Bible is not saying, try really hard. Beat yourself up and try really hard to be gentle. Beat yourself up and try really hard to be kind because then you'll become loving. That is not what the Bible is saying. Jesus is teaching us here the main point. The main point is that if I actually grow in my love for God, all those other things will happen automatically. They'll happen as his Spirit lives in me. And I will be able to become a person who loves others. Think about the last moment, one of the last moments of Jesus' life before he died on the cross. He had been betrayed by all of his closest friends, betrayed by one and abandoned by all the rest. He'd been beaten all night. People had lied about him. He'd then been taken up on a hill and crucified. He'd been nailed to a cross. And as he's being lifted up, nailed to a cross, and he's about to die, what does he say? He prays a prayer. You remember what it is? He prays that those people who are killing him would be forgiven for what they're doing because they don't understand what they're doing. How in the world, that is what he's talking about here. Loving other people as much as you love yourself. In fact, in that moment, he clearly loves them more than he loves himself. How can a human being ever get to that place? Only by being completely filled with love for God. In that moment, even though Jesus is suffering many things, he's not thinking about himself. He's thinking about his Father in heaven. He's thinking about how he can trust his Father in heaven. And what amazing things God is going to do even through the suffering that he's right now enduring. And because of that, he's able to love his neighbor, the person close to him, as much as he loves himself. This is an amazing reality. So how can we grow in our love for God? If that is the point, if that's what we need to do, and that is the point of our entire church, right? What do we say about Community of Hope Church? And this is the point of every church, really, or else there is no point to it. It can be said in different ways. The way we say it is helping people grow in their relationship. That is their love for God and for each other. That's why we're here. That's not only why we're here in this building, that's why we exist on this earth. That's the point of life. So how can we actually do it? If you say, I see now. I see that Jesus is telling me the one thing I should put the most energy into is growing as a person who really loves God. How can I do it? Well, let me ask you this. That person who loved you when you were a kid, did you love them back? That person, when you were around them, you always felt safe, accepted, truly loved. It wasn't so much about what they did. It was about a reality of the relationship between you and them. They really did love you deep down, and you felt it. Did you love them back? Well, the answer is yes. When we experience love from someone else, we automatically respond with love in our own hearts. How did I get to the point where I love my granny? I do love my granny a lot. How did I get there? I simply spent time around her and paid attention to her. And because she loved me, love for her grew inside of me automatically. How then can we grow to love God more? We can grow to love God more very easily. He loves us more than we can possibly imagine. The only thing we have to do to grow in our true love for him is just spend time with him and pay attention to him. That's all we have to do. What if, these are some questions that are in your notes to think about this week. What if every day you spent real time paying attention to God and his love for you? How would that affect you? What if you experimented with that this week? Not just Bible reading so you can get it done. Not just a prayer because there are things that have to happen in the world, but time spent paying attention to God himself and the fact that he loves you. How would that change you? And what if we spent time this week paying attention to the people who are near us and the fact that God loves them as well? How would that change them? We're going to wrap up with one final story about my granny. She was a Christian her whole life, really. She grew up in church. She had a great love for God. She got married young. She got married when she was 19. Actually, she might have been 18 when she got married. Back then, that was more normal, but it was young even then. Her marriage got really, really hard as they went through life. In fact, there was a point where they separated for a while, and they thought there is no way forward in this marriage. My grandparents. They decided to stay together because, and only because, they loved God. And they knew that's what he would want them to do. They actually, for a number of years, maybe even a couple of decades, they couldn't stand each other. They would talk bad about each other in front of each other, in front of their kids, in front of their grandkids. And they would say the only reason, they said this regularly when I was growing up, the only reason we're still together is because God. Is because we know that's what God wants us to do and we love him. But we don't like each other. Isn't that sad? Now here's the amazing thing. By the end of my grandfather's life, when you watched the two of them together, they said all the same things. Oh yeah, we don't really like each other. And we're only together because we love God. You could tell in the way they said it, in the way they acted, in the way they were constantly around each other, that they loved each other deeply. I would say they were an example, a shining example of love for each other. And yet they hadn't admitted it out loud. They were still pretending like they were where they had been at 30 years before, that they hated each other's guts and couldn't stand each other. What had happened in their lives? Because they loved God, they had walked in his way, even when it felt like walking through fire. And because they had love for him, he was able to change them to the place where they had love for their neighbor, the person who's close to them. This is what Jesus is talking about. Let's pray.